Hi, everyone. Welcome to our presentation today on effective engagement surveys for higher education. My name is Charles Rogel. I work as a principal consultant here at DecisionWise. TMA Performance, our new name. We've recently merged with a company called TMA out of Holland. And our new company name is TMA Performance. So if many of you know us as DecisionWise, that'll be our new company name going forward. More details to come on that topic and the different services that we'll be augmenting and adding to our portfolio here. But anyways, I work as a consultant here, work with a lot of clients in higher education, debriefing results, analyzing our data, looking at benchmarks, been here with DecisionWise 21 years now. I want to introduce my colleague here, Christian Nielsen. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Great to be here. Christian Nielsen. I joined DecisionWise 11 years ago. So I'm the new guy compared to Charles. And similar to Charles, I've worked as a consultant with a number of our clients and really love geeking out about survey data and excited to be part of this conversation.
Great. And as we go through this today, we'll cover several different topics. I've got teed up here first some of the dynamics or challenges that we typically see in higher education. So first I want to kind of talk about, well, what do we typically see? And this will kind of determine the approach we take as we set up a survey and the questions we're going to ask, the topics we're interested in measuring. Because what we're trying to do, again, is get data back to leadership to make some decisions on some of these dynamics that we're talking about here, as well as the typical kind of challenges that we see in higher ed. So this slide here, we've kind of got broken out the typical, what we call the most important populations. Every time we do a survey, we're very concerned about, okay, what are the key populations and what are the differences that we expect to see in some of their perceptions as we measure this stuff. And so in general, we've kind of got the faculty, admin, and staff groupings, which most, of course, all of you are familiar with. The idea, though, is that, faculty, they have different concerns than administrators and staff. A lot of times it's even hard to get faculty to take the survey. They sometimes group together and say, no, we're not interested or whatever, we'll do our own thing. But a lot of self-direction there. There's sometimes some animosity between how they're being managed or influenced by administrators. And then they're also, utilizing staff to kind of deliver on their needs and create a great student experience. Administrators, they get viewed as sometimes being more removed from academic concerns. So they're kind of the corporate leaders, trying to make sure we have the right budget and can really run an effective institution. But that might tie into creating more bureaucracy or challenges for other people. And then staff sometimes feel less valued. They're the ones that are they feel like they're doing most of the work or the heavy lifting in the organization. And sometimes the decisions that are made are, leave them thinking that they were least considered, like the stepchildren maybe of the organization. Christian, anything you want to add in terms of these dynamics and how they play out?
No, I'm glad we're starting here because this is, I think, at the core of what makes this type of survey so different than other industries, where we have these three distinct groups are very unique to higher ed, and like a lot of things with modern organizations, some of the friction and challenge comes from communication and misunderstanding and misaligned kind of agendas between these different stakeholder groups. So I think it sets the stage nicely.
Yeah. And I think the challenge for higher ed is really trying to get these groups to kind of function and work together, alignment, that kind of stuff. And so that's what we see a lot that's unique about higher ed when we do these types of surveys. I've got a list of challenges that we typically run into and hear from and measure, that score lower a lot of times in higher ed. And some of the macro challenges that are out there that contribute to some of these perceptions are topics around funding and growth of institution. In general, we see that, well, the data shows that enrollment in higher ed is decreasing somewhat because of population dynamics, and others because maybe people are not opting for higher ed and going into trades and other organizations where maybe the value of higher ed doesn't have the as much value to people as it did previously. And so there's kind of a shift or a challenge that higher ed has in terms of carving out its relevance in the market, so to speak, or marketing, at least for young people to go to school. The other thing, federal funding, there's a lot of turmoil right now at the federal level that influences how grants are appropriated for research, as well as just the education department in general is a mess. And so that is influencing how higher ed is trying to make decisions at the administrative level. Kristen, do you want to talk about some of these bullet points we have here and what you typically see?
Yeah, as you were talking, I was really just zeroing in on administrative burden. A lot of times we see different expectations based on industry, and education and healthcare both have this interesting and really unique aspect that people come there with a kind of an intact sense of purpose. This is a calling. This is something I'm passionate about. I want to go deep here. I care about the student experience. I care deeply about the research. And when you have those elements in place, then it's kind of the organization's at risk of getting in the way of that meaning and purpose. And so anytime things are perceived as overly burdensome or bureaucracy or entropy that just takes away from the meaning that these people got into the role for, that's where we start to see diminished engagement. We see turnover, and sometimes we don't see turnover in places like higher ed because there's a lot of retention is usually pretty high there, and so people stay, but they're less engaged because some of the things the organization do are distracting. So that's probably longer winded than you wanted there, Charles. But yeah, administrative burden, understaffed. We don't have the budgets to work. Increasingly expectations from administration is do more with less. Additional responsibilities, wear more hats, career advancement. That's a different dynamic for growth and development in an educational setting. And tenure adds some complexity and some of the status that it goes along with that, and the hoops to jump through and expectations and transparency there. Communication, shared governance. Does everyone have a voice? As you talked about those three stakeholder groups, that's what I'm thinking about with the staff. Often they feel like, hey, we're the unseen workers behind, that are doing all the work with not necessarily getting a lot of credit or public recognition, or feel like their voice is unheard. And then resistance to feedback. I'd also add, just in general, sometimes there's some complexity around the platform we're using and sense of trust because of the different stakeholders in the mix there, in terms of is this really a safe experience to provide feedback?
Really good points. Yeah, and we'll kind of dive into this. And honestly, we don't have a lot of solutions to offer, but we want to make sure what you're doing here is measuring these things and really understanding what's leading to retention or turnover or engagement, because that's good data that leaders need to know about to understand how they're impacting the population and the workforce. So let's kind of transition now. Now we'll get into the kind of the more nuts and bolts about measuring engagement, setting this up, and kind of positioning it a bit more for what we're doing in higher education. Christian, I'm going to have you talk about this model or this setup, because I think you had a lot of contribution in terms of how we kind of came up with this this flow.
Well, and anyone that's been in our webinars before know that we often like to start these conversations just by getting some clarity on some or shared definitions on these terms. So culture, employee experience, and employee engagement. So culture is what we build. I think I mentioned on a webinar recently that I heard a great quote that no organization has a culture. Every organization is a culture. It really is everything about an organization creates and reinforces culture. So I like the definition we've got here: a set of beliefs, norms, guiding belief, or values, norms, guiding beliefs, and understandings that is shared by members of an organization. And I love the second part, and is taught to new members as a way to feel, think, and behave. No matter what you're teaching in a formal onboarding program, the culture is going to fill in the gaps and teach new employees how we do things around here. In fact, that more casual definition, the way we do things around here, that's our culture. Once we add people to that culture, they're going to experience that. And that's what we're talking about, this middle category, employee experience, the sum of perceptions employees have about their interactions with the organization in which they work. It's the impact of the culture on the employees. just add people, and then they'll have an experience. And then this third category where we spend so much of our time trying to understand and optimize for employee engagement. It's the reward. I like to think of the employee experience as the invitation, and the extent to which they take that invitation is what shows up in our engagement levels. An emotional state where we feel passionate, energetic, and committed to the work. In turn, we fully invest our best selves in the work that we do. It's how much of my best self do I feel like bringing to this effort? And so the employee experience is, this is the experience we're creating, and engagement is how much do I choose to bring to this experience. It's the emotional response to the employee experience.
This is great. And that leads us then into what we define as employee engagement. And you just touched on it on the previous slide, but we say it's kind of this two-part definition. It's both a feeling or emotional state as well as what we do. So there's an outcome. Generally, when we're more engaged, we want to do our best work, and we contribute, hearts, spirits, minds, and hands into the work that we do. We look at this, though, engagement as separate from this term of satisfaction. A lot of times these ideas get conflated. And we definitely see a clear delineation between these elements. And satisfaction, we usually define using the items in the parentheses there, where the factors that influence how satisfied I am with my job are topics like pay and benefits, training, remote work opportunities, resources to do my job. When those things are working for me, I generally don't think about it. Like, that's on par with my expectations. But when they're not, they can be a detractor from my overall experience in the organization. And if they're not working for me, I might be looking around for another opportunity or another job. So we say they drive retention. We need to have these things kind of working for people, on par with people's expectations, so that they'll stay with the organization. As a result, they form a foundation upon which engagement can grow. So generally, engagement sits on top of satisfaction elements, but it drives performance. This is about your motivation, passion, energy towards your job. And then the drivers or factors that really contribute to engagement are these magic elements. And so as we've done our research over the past 30 years, these topics keep rising to the top when we do a multiple driver analysis to say, what other topics on the survey are influencing how engaged people are? Well, it's topics related to meaning and growth and autonomy and connection. So magic emerged as kind of the typical drivers we see that create engagement or motivate people to want to do their best work. And as you touched on, Christian, meaning is really derived from educating students, from the satisfaction people get from seeing students succeed and have a good student experience there at the university or college. Then the other way we measure engagement is by using a subset of questions on the survey. So normally we're using these 4 questions, and you'll notice that they're very similar to each other. They're kind of outcome statements. So we say they're more about an outcome of the overall experience, but not necessarily very actionable in terms of what can I do to help people love their job or find enjoyment. We use the other questions to really get at those answers. So you'll notice that I've got results here for what we measure, and this is in the colleges and universities. So these scores represent what we've collected in our benchmark from other colleges and universities and how people typically respond here. So on this question about enjoying the work I perform, the job I perform, 84% of all the answers from everyone in colleges and universities, they say agree or strongly agree to this statement. And that is 2 points higher than we measure on that same question in our entire global benchmark. So we can see that there's a couple items here that normally score above what we typically measure for other organizations when we're looking at education specifically. My job is fulfilling and challenging at 76% favorable. That's right on par with what we see across. So we take these engagement anchor questions and we want to create some profiles to understand how engaged people are in their work. So based on how you respond to these statements, if you're saying mostly strongly agree to those questions before those anchor statements, we put you in this fully engaged category. If you're responding mostly agree, we say you're a key contributor. Now we measure both of these groups together to get an overall engagement index of 78%. So we'd say 78% of people in your population are engaged in their work. Other organizations might only take the strongly agree responses. So they'll say, hey, 29% of people are engaged. Everyone else is not engaged. We've got a problem. We don't think you have that big of a problem. So generally, most people are pretty engaged in their work. What we're most interested in are these people in the opportunity group, because they're kind of on the fence on those engagement statements. So we really want to find out what's going on there. Why are those people less engaged or kind of on the fence about their engagement in this opportunity group? And then the fully disengaged population, generally they've kind of checked out. They're looking for other work, and they're not happy. They're disagreeing with those engagement statements. They're harder to re-engage overall. Couple comparisons here. We look at our industry benchmarks, and I've got a few highlighted. Best in class, basically the top 10% in our database. We see really high engagement there. 91% of people in those organizations we say are engaged, 41% fully engaged in a best in class organization. But colleges and universities are right up there. So you'll notice that we see 80% overall engagement there, tied there with professional services. Our global benchmark is there in the middle. There's that 78% index for global. And then what I wanted to point out is also public administration. These are kind of government institutions, both city and county and local governments that we work with. We normally see lower engagement. So in some cases, I say, well, colleges, universities are somewhat bureaucratic, somewhat quasi-government oriented, but their engagement is much higher than we see in public administration. And part of that, I think, is due to the service that you provide in terms of educating students. Christian, anything else you wanted to add in terms of these comparisons or what I just explained?
No, I'm always looking. I see a lot of correlations between healthcare and colleges and universities. The difference is we see higher burnout in healthcare. So where we see meaning in both of those, we don't always see the burnout. Now, for those of you in the college and university environments may recognize pockets of it, but as a whole, I think that's how I'm making sense of the difference in scores there, that a lot of it is the lack of burnout, you don't suffer from the same thing that we see in healthcare, but you still get the benefit of a more high meaning work environment.
Yeah, that's a good point. That healthcare benchmarks are very interesting. So then we're going to transition. So let's kind of get into the nuts and bolts of this. So we want to talk about kind of the survey questions and what to really measure on your survey and what's important to kind of understand about the environment in higher ed. As a sample, I've got kind of what we would typically display. So we would say we want to have questions about the team, supervisor, the job, and then the organization overall. And I'll show you these questions here in a moment. We'll talk about them and how important they are or what to measure. But generally at the team environment, people are having a good experience. And so when I'm working with my colleagues, we help each other out. We generally see higher perceptions, higher agreement. So the 80% means the percent of agree and strongly agree responses, 15% neutral, and then 5% of the responses were disagree there. The supervisor scores are also pretty high. So generally most people having a good experience with their manager, although there's a few where they're not, and we can easily determine those in an organization. Then we have questions about the job, and then the organization statements are usually the harder questions on the survey. And generally as they're looking up and saying, hey, what's going on with administration or the organization, we see lower perceptions. And you can track this year over year. I'm just kind of showing a sample slide here of how these scores typically play out. These are not based on benchmarks. This is just some demo data to give you an idea of how this typically looks. So now I want to look at each of these questions. So I've got some slides here teed up that we want to talk about. And I bolded a couple questions that I think are more important in healthcare or higher education. So as looking at this, when you're asking questions about the team dynamics, most times it works pretty well. And we normally add about 4, maybe 5 questions in this section to really understand, hey, is the team working together well? We measure things like collaboration. We kind of have a theme here, impact, basically people taking accountability. And then most people get along with their teammates. The problem we see usually in the team dynamic, if there is low scores, is there might be 1 or 2 people that are hard to work with, and they're kind of undermining the effectiveness of the team. And I think the pivotal question here is really, do people treat each other with respect? That's kind of the buy-in or the lowest level that you need to achieve. But the accountability is more important. So are we kind of pulling our own weight, and are people kind of following through on their commitments? Anything else about team dynamics here you want to add, Christian?
No, just in that, we want to see the high team scores, but this kind of sets the stage later for we don't want to see high team scores at the expense of the organization. If
Yeah.
it's really an us versus them in any environment, then it becomes counterproductive for engagement. But strong team scores are great, but not if they're not if it's at the expense of the organization scores.
Yeah, and the one I'll point out is that top question on collaboration normally scores really high at the team level. When we ask about other departments and functions, which I'll show you here in a moment, we normally see lower perceptions there.
Yeah.
Then we have kind of a group of questions about the supervisor. Now, the difficulty we find in higher ed is sometimes it's hard to determine who your direct supervisor is. There's some dotted line relationships a lot of times, and some different ways in which you're kind of managing people. And so here you might add some wording to really define who your supervisor, direct supervisor, the person you report to or does your performance appraisal. Those are kind of the people we're trying to ask about, because again, you can provide data to small groups. Any team that has 5 or more responses can receive results. And so here we get some good information for a particular manager. The 2 I've highlighted here, ongoing feedback is really important in this section. It kind of drives perceptions on a lot of these other statements. And also empowerment. What we sense in higher ed is that people generally, especially faculty, have a high sense of autonomy. That's really important to them. And the more empowered they feel to do their work, the more engaged they will be. Empowerment ties to the A in the MAGIC model, autonomy again. Anything else here, Christian?
No, it's yeah. I mean, it kind of goes hand in hand with the team things. Often, I'm looking for evidence that they're not only supervisors, not only being managing the basics of their relationship, but also connecting them into the larger efforts of the organization. What's fun is in other industries, I actually use the phrase, are they helping to build what I call school spirit, connecting into the larger organization. That really applies here. Are they speaking kindly and favorably about the larger?
They're representing the university well.
Exactly.
I like that. And then the job questions, I highlighted a few here. So there's a lot of topics here. You'll notice in this grouping, what I didn't list are some of the engagement anchor questions that we've already reviewed. So typically in the job section, we have those questions about, feeling like it's fulfilling and challenging and so on. Some of the other things are some of the nuts and bolts. So the enablement statements are kind of these satisfaction elements that we typically talk about. Technology, tools, and systems sometimes is at play. But what we see in education are these bolded statements. So like systems, processes, and procedures, that kind of gets at this topic of bureaucracy. So when people are feeling like, oh my gosh, there's so many policies and bureaucracy, some of that is enforced by the university, just bureaucracy that's grown over time. But some of it is external in terms of federal mandates or requirements or laws that you have to follow. So some of that kind of interrupts or might form a barrier. That then contributes a bit to higher senses of workload. And also if people are feeling understaffed, we will see lower perceptions on this question about the amount of work I'm expected to do is reasonable. The meaning and purpose question there, my job provides a sense of meaning and purpose, normally scores really high. So most people are really feeling that this is working for them as they try to educate students. But again, if there's too many barriers, that gets interrupted because the meaning kind of gets taken away, and because they're so involved in other things that aren't really fulfilling. And finally, the shared governance statement is kind of measured with this question: I'm satisfied with my level of involvement in decisions that affect me. That's a tough question. It normally scores pretty low. And that's a harder one too, because you're not always able to involve everyone in some of these organization-wide decisions. So next slide we have are the topics related to my organization. These are the tougher questions. So normally there's a little bit more distance between staff and the organization overall. Here they're looking at these statements and maybe thinking about administration type people and leaders in the organization. You can have sections in here that talk about or ask about senior leaders as well. Here we have it phrased more as the organization. And so the first one on collaboration is a tough one as well. Most times within the team, we are always collaborating, helping each other. If I got to work across a department or function or a college or something like that, then that's where it breaks down and it's more difficult. And a lot of times people are saying, I don't know who to go to get information or help, or who supports me on what. or response time is slow, or whatever. There's a variety of topics that go into that. The voice one also comes up, especially with this shared governance idea where the organization values employee input, feedback, and suggestions. The meaning statement here about the mission and goals being important to me personally, that one normally scores really high. It's one of the highest scoring questions on a survey in higher education. It's an important question too, because again, as people feel like they're aligned with the mission, they will experience more meaning. And then one that's more unique and important with the higher ed is this well, we call it belonging. You could also call it an inclusion question or the equity question. But employees are treated equally with fairness and respect, regardless of background and position. This is where the staff perceptions are typically lower on this statement, and sometimes faculty too, because they feel like, hey, faculty is being, opinions are being dismissed by administration. So that's kind of the dynamics we see there, some of the important topics that I'm looking for when I'm evaluating results in higher education.
Yeah, and of course, all of these items, we're not only looking at hierarchy and those three stakeholder groups, but we're also looking at those underlying demographics. So, especially on those inclusion items, are we seeing a difference based on, race, ethnicity, age, any of those underlying characteristics? So, all of these filtered through several different lenses.
Yeah, and that's a good segue because I got two more questions here, but we'll talk about kind of how to then analyze these as well and look at those demographic comparisons. One last, I almost forgot the comment question. So there's a temptation to include a lot of comment questions. Sometimes clients will say, well, can we put a comment question after each one? If they answer disagree, can it prompt them to tell us why? Well, you might end up with a really long survey if someone's not happy, and then they tend to kind of skip those or maybe abandon the survey altogether because they realize it's going to take longer. So we normally say, use these two questions at the end. They're kind of catch-all questions. We will hear what's most important to employees on the survey by using these questions. What can we do to make it better? And what do you like about working here? So it really gives us a feel for what other topics might not be included. Notice on those questions that I showed you, we didn't ask about compensation or benefits specifically. And usually we recommend not asking about those directly on those questions, but capturing it here in the comments, because we don't necessarily want to set the expectation that we're going to make changes to that. But maybe you did make changes recently. Maybe there's been some activity, and so you want to measure it directly, so you can do so. We do have clients that do that. In this case, we're using the comments to kind of help fill in the gaps a bit around some of the other topics maybe that we didn't measure in those questions. And I'll show you how you can analyze this too. There's a lot of good tools available now where you can use AI and other methods to really understand what people are saying. Okay, so touching on what you were just mentioning here, Christian, kind of how to analyze or look at your data. I like to use this as a reference point to tell me, okay, how, I've got a set of data, and I'll show you kind of how we do this in our online reporting tool. But, you probably have a tool if you've done this already. And this will also help you do the same with kind of any platform that you're using. But overall, what I'm looking for when I look at the overall score and even the engagement index score are trends. Did it go up or down? And also benchmark comparisons. Is it high or low compared to what we typically see? Then I go into all the questions and I sort them kind of high and low. I look at trends and benchmarks there because that'll tell me what are the opportunities or the key themes that are emerging in my questions. Like what's scoring high? What are those items related to? What's scoring low? What's the common theme there? And then, as you mentioned, Christian, the demographic populations, specifically the key populations like staff and faculty and administration. And then the comments I like because you really can understand and get some context in terms of where these scores are coming from and why. So I got a couple slides I'll show you, but then I want to kind of show you how to navigate or really explore the data using an online platform. Again, score calculation format. We're always using a 5-point scale for benchmarks. It's an industry standard. Most people are used to using a 5-point agreement scale. So everyone kind of knows what a 3 and a 4 and a 5 is essentially as you're looking at the scale here. But we combine those to kind of say how many of these statements are people agreeing with or disagreeing with overall. And then we don't factor in the don't know or the not answered questions. As you're looking at the data, this is one comparison that's really important. So this is just sample data that we put together so you could see, are there big differences between populations here? I'm looking for like 5-point differences overall by these groups. And then you can even look at the questions themselves to say, are there big differences in terms of how they answered specific questions as well? Because this is looking at the overall score for maybe all 50 questions that you asked on the survey. And then next, we look at, well, I'm going to come back to comment themes. I'm going to jump into the online tool here for a moment and show you kind of what to, or how we might approach this data. So what I mentioned before is that first we're looking at this overall score. 78% of the answers were agree or strongly agree. I'm looking at sample data for a sample company that we've kind of created in our system with 629 people, 542 responses we got on the survey. I'm noticing that overall, for all the questions on the survey, we saw a 2% increase from the year before. And this is kind of how we segment and break those distribution of responses out. Next, I'll go down and I'll say, okay, well, here's all the questions we asked on the survey. You'll notice several of these are from the slides that we showed earlier. And there's questions about the job, about my supervisor, the team, and the organization. What you can start doing, though, is sorting. So here I want to sort on the right-hand side and say, which of these questions really improved the most year over year? And so here I'll see this question about growth went up 12 points compared to what we measured before, how my work contributes to the overall success of the organization, kind of the sense of impact. Here's another growth statement. So this tells us that a lot of the emphasis we might have put, hopefully we put into growth opportunities for employees, we saw more people answer positively to this. And what this means is like a 10-point increase out of 538 people means about 54 people agreed with this statement more this time than we saw last year overall in this survey. So that's a significant improvement for this size of population. There's also some items that decreased a little. So if I sort this the opposite direction, we'll notice that there's one item that decreased by 10 points. There's one item that didn't have any change or an NA because we added this question or changed this question this year. But supervisor empowerment went down a bit. So we were at 70 or 89% favorable on that statement, and it went down by 10%. Now, benchmark wise, that's pretty good. I'll show you a comparison here in a moment. So we lost some ground on a statement. We're still not too much lower than we typically measure. And then vision and goals perceptions decreased a bit. So we can kind of see how that plays out. Next, I'll do some other sorts. I'm like, well, what are the high scores? What do people really enjoy about working here? And so if you sort the statements high to low, you'll notice that a lot of the statements are about the people I work with on my team and my supervisor. Here's one about my contribution that went up by 12 points. Listening at the team level, but a lot of the questions about the team and supervisor scored high, like we typically see in what I showed on that one previous slide. And then next, I'll go and say, okay, which statements on the survey really scored the lowest? Well, it's about working effectively across departments and functions. That's typically one of the hardest statements. Good news is we saw a 6% improvement on that from the previous year. So now we get a feel about what's working or not working. Here's responsive to ideas and suggestions, communicating effectively, workload. Here's another question about valuing feedback. So what we're seeing is there's kind of 3 questions about communication, 2 about listening, another question here about communicating across departments and functions. So a lot of stuff about communication stands out, as well as this workload statement, but it went up by 3 points. So we can kind of see what's at play, what most people, what might be bothering most people, but really 32 stands out as this working across departments and functions. What you can do here as well is you can look at question 32 specifically. And so what I encourage you to do in a system or online system is look at this statement. And what I like to do is look at this by department. And so I'll look at the department demographics here. There's several different demographic filters that you're usually able to utilize in an organization. And then you can look at, okay, where does collaboration across the organization suffer the most or differ the most? You can see security here, less agreement, human resources, less agreement on that statement, more disagreement coming from marketing, operations a little bit higher. So it's kind of low for a lot of these groups, but it's more acute in some of these areas overall. So I went a little bit deep there. The other thing you can do, and some of the advantage here is, again, If you're working with an outside provider, so a lot of you, I think, probably have an internal platform that you're probably using to run the survey, on an internal survey tool. If you're outsourcing this to another organization like TMA Performance or others, the advantage is the data stays on their side, and so people feel a little bit more confident in the anonymity of the process and not being identified. And the confidentiality threshold that we're using to collect data is based on having 5 or more responses in any group to show any data. So we're protecting confidentiality and anonymity that way in the results. The other benefit is that you can get some benchmarking comparisons. And so you'll notice here that we have our global benchmark applied to this data set. And I can look at this and say, which of the questions are scoring high compared to what we see in our global benchmark? There's several of those around the supervisor interaction. And then which of these statements are scoring lower compared to what we measure in our global benchmark? Well, here's some here around the vision and goals of the organization, trusting people to do their jobs, progress on projects and initiatives. Those are scoring slightly below what we see. The working effectively across departments and functions. Yeah, that's lower than we typically measure, even though it went up 6 points from the previous year. So now you have some context in terms of how well we're doing by applying a benchmark, looking at the trend, and that sort of thing. Christian, I'm talking a lot. Anything you want to interject as we proceed?
I think this helps paint the picture of what that discovery and exploration process looks like. And if we set this data up or set up the structure properly from the beginning, it's very powerful for colleges, universities to be able to understand not just demographics, but different departments, different leaders. And really, we're trying to answer 2 questions. What experience are we creating? And is it the right experience? Is it leading to outcomes that we're comfortable with? I like that you mentioned the trade-offs of using an internal system like an HRIS. Something we often also see with higher ed is they've got research tools, and sometimes there's a temptation to use those for employee research or staff research. And there's some real trade-offs with that. The same ones apply in terms of lack of benchmarking data and things like that, but also just the perceived trust in the trust in the process. Is this really safe if we're using the research tools that I also use, as an academic. So there's some real value in leveraging a third party to help with this process.
Good points. 2 other things I wanted to highlight here. A lot of times we can look at demographic comparisons, and we encourage you to do so. The one that we mentioned earlier were the demographic comparisons related to staff, faculty, and administration. Here, I'll look at a couple others. I don't have like an education data set to play with, but when we're looking at the sample data set, and of course, it's going to hang on me while I'm trying to do a demonstration. We can identify differences between some of these groups and where we want to explore the data in more detail. See why I think I asked too much of it right for the moment. What I'll do is I'll pause on that one because I have another couple areas, but go ahead, Christian, anything you want to add?
No, we can jump back into the slides for a minute while that.
Yeah. So the one I wanted to get to as well within the comments, or at least in the comments analysis, is just show you kind of how to explore your comments. So we usually ask those 2 open-ended questions. One of those is, what are the areas that need most improvement in this organization? And we usually, what you can do is you can apply technology that counts topics by theme. So first you get a feel for what are the topics that got mentioned the most in the comments in response to this question. Here we saw 29% of the responses. Someone said something about internal processes. And in this case, what we did is we said, okay, if you wrote a paragraph and you wrote about several different topics, you would get counted into each of these different categories. Some of it was about staffing and recruitment. Some of it was about senior leadership, fairness and favoritism, and so on. So you kind of get a feel for what's at play and what's going on here. The interesting thing, compensation is kind of farther down the list in terms of this data. Sometimes it's at the top of the list. Normally we see internal processes pretty high. And what this is going to talk to, or at least point to a bit, are work staff shortages and higher perceptions around workload as well coming out. So The other thing we've done is looked at, okay, what are the responses we typically hear from higher ed? And so as you apply an AI comment summary or AI summary to your comments, what you can do is then kind of pull out some bullet points or specific topics around these things that the comment count or the theme count highlight. So people talk about compensation and workload. What are they talking about? Well, staff salaries are insufficient to keep up with inflation, cost of living. We're seeing that a lot. Workload isn't unevenly distributed. So we have like this policy, other duties as assigned, which people are taking advantage of and creating unfairness. Career advancement, promotion within departments, kind of factors in. Leadership and communication, so leaders being kind of out of touch, unsupportive, poor communication, lack of consistency, and then lack of involvement in decision-making processes. So this is where we're hearing like lack of listening and really kind of taking into account some of these things. Now, we understand administration, they have some hard decisions to make that people are not going to like, but you'll kind of see some of that emerge in the comments here. And then usually in in higher ed, people are also somewhat talking about the facilities and resources. So everyone's kind of competing or vying for better facilities, better equipment. Sometimes it's like, hey, I'm trying to teach and my room temperature, I can't adjust the thermometer and it's always hot or it's always cold or something like that. That's a common one. Parking is always an issue. So those are some things that kind of emerge in the comments that you'll see. The good thing is you can go back into the comments and see, well, how many people talked about parking or how many people talked about listening or fairness? And you'll get a feel for, is it like a large group or smaller group? And so this way allows you to kind of target or pinpoint those. You can look at these comments by faculty or staff. And so these are different ways you can explore these comments to really fill in the gaps a bit on some of the responses we're seeing on the survey.
And it's, and if it gives some clarity on some of the quantitative things that we asked questions about, where we have those scaled responses, but also just organically, like you mentioned, if it's on their mind and we didn't ask a question about it, it's really interesting to see how those, what emerges here. Compensation is a really great one. We have compensation questions, but I prefer not to ask about them because often we can't address them directly, but an open comment will let us know if it's on their mind.
For sure. So the other thing I do here is I kind of farm a bit for maybe different questions we want to add to the next survey. And, if we're building initiatives around some of these things, then we can measure them directly on future questions on the survey to see how we're doing and progressing on those topics there. So you might include, for example, in the future, a question about the facilities and needs there that we're measuring overall. The real important part of this is you're going to walk away with some topics and themes for the organization to focus on. And it could be listening and communication like we talked about, or maybe collaboration across departments and functions. But you're also trying to empower your managers with data like we're showing here. And so you can do that in a couple of ways. You can provide them access to your online platform for the segment or group of data that they're responsible for. So permission-based, access to their report. What we like to do is provide them kind of a packaged result, because we find that we get very low utilization from managers actually logging into the system and sorting around. Part of the problem is they don't want to log into something, number one. And number two, they want to learn a new platform and how to navigate it. And so if you're delivering a PDF report or a produced report for every person, it goes right to their inbox. They open it up. They're going to look at the data more quickly. Maybe some of them will want online access to explore it in more detail, but generally a PDF report or a static report is going to be sufficient for their needs. What you're trying to do, though, is build into your report some tools and resources that they can use. In fact, let me just show you a sample that can be used to action plan on the data. And so you can add in additional topics and areas to explore here that helps them really understand and utilize the data. So in our instance, and we can send you a sample of this as well if you'd like to kind of try to recreate this within your own tools. But there's usually some instructional text here about how to approach the data in terms of looking for themes and coming up with questions. The overall scores and data points are very similar to what we were showing in the online tool, but it just has some ways to interpret the data. It provides highs and lows in terms of overall results. And so, again, you're trying to provide data in a way that is consumable for a manager and that facilitates action planning around around the results overall. And so here you can see there's different groupings for even the questions that we measured on the survey. You can provide an overall score for engagement here, but really what we like to do is provide both the comments, and if you're not comfortable giving them the verbatim comments, which we don't recommend actually, you can do an AI summary generated list of comments as well. So there's a variety of options here. What's important though is you include some actioning instruction, whatever that is, in terms of, hey, here's how you would approach the data and have an action planning meeting with your team. And then we're hoping that you will create a goal based on the results that you're seeing that you come up with within your group as a team. So what within your area can we focus on to create a better employee experience? With that, you can also provide some resources. What we usually do is have some that are kind of teed up with some media links to different topics around growth or tools and resources, cross-functional collaboration, things like that. So it helps managers to kind of think about the topic and create some action planning goals within their team. But we're trying to make it easy for managers to come up with a goal and not overburden them as well. So the rollout really is the important part of how you're going to use the data going forward. And that's where we kind of get into this piece here. Christian, I was going to have you kind of walk through these different steps and provide your perspective.
Yeah. So nearly every single survey admin has some form of these components, and it usually starts once we get the results in. Well, before the executive debrief, we have an initial review with HR. We walk through the data, then we do a deeper analysis, create an executive debrief, a slide deck for the executive audience. Those sessions are usually 60 to 90 minutes, sometimes a little bit longer, depending on the size of the team and their level of engagement with this. From there, and one thing that we would add right after the executive debrief, we recommend some kind of all hands communication. Hey, we've heard the results here, and then walking through the next steps. But then the next step after the executive and that communication are typically distributing executive reports. So how do we get the reports out to the top of the organization? Then we'd have some form of letting managers know the results, and usually a little less detail than what's included in the executive debrief. And then they would all receive their own individual manager reports. Our setup is typically we would give anyone that have 5 or more respondents a manager report, a tailored report of their results. And then there would be, the all employee company, debrief email. I pulled that up a little bit. Sometimes that's right after the executive debrief. Sometimes that goes out with the manager debrief or manager reports to help set the stage for manager one-on-ones manager-led team debriefs on the 2 lines down. But depending on the level of attention we want to give managers, or we have the resources to give managers, it's really great if they can have a one-on-one debrief with department heads or HRBPs, where walk through the results, understand that prior to leading those team meetings, where sometimes those are called discovery meetings or a debrief meeting, sharing the results with the team. Here are our results, having a conversation, and then setting the stage for team action planning meetings. We often decouple those. Let's hear the results, and then let's have some time to process, come back and action plan, and then submitting those action plans. And then the test for any organization is, can we keep this alive and some form of priority throughout a very, very busy year? We know the work doesn't stop to take action on employee feedback. So we're trying to weave that into the flow of work and keep some level of awareness and priority throughout the year.
Yeah, it's a really good point. That's the hard part. And notice that we kind of have this 3-month cadence, as it takes time to roll this out. A lot of this is determined by when these meetings occur. Like, when does your executive team typically meet? When do all your managers typically meet? And so you're trying to meet these kind of typical deadlines to fit this in as one of the components that you'll use to get action on. So realize as you're rolling this out, you don't have to go this deep in the organization. Maybe if you're doing this the first year, you might only require action plans for those that have lower scores within the organization. And again, you're trying not to layer on additional work, but you're trying to get response to create a good experience. Some of the initiatives that emerge might already be at play. So if we realize that staffing is an issue, I'm sure that's not a surprise to that manager or that department, and they're working on that. They just need to communicate their progress to employees. All right, so I've got a few other topics here in terms of what we do for organization action planning. So the prime example as we look at this is, okay, we've identified maybe some topics in organizations we want to work on. Maybe it's around communication. What you're trying to do is define what is working or not working about communication in our organization, and then what should it look like in the future. So instead of jumping right into action planning, we want to make sure we define the problem very well and define what the future looks like, because then it's easier to create these action steps to get there. So let me give you an example. We talk about top-down communication. We have a group of leaders together, maybe other employees. We're kind of putting all these ideas on the board about what's not working for top-down communication. There's several things that we're collecting. We've got like 10 different items here. But what you're doing is you're trying to synthesize and summarize a bit what we're getting from this conversation. The first activity is really to cross out those items that are not within our control. So there's some of these things we can't solve for. We can't make people read emails. Managers are always going to be busy. There's going to be some resistance. This other stuff, though, we can take action on. So when we summarize what this looks like, or what what the current state is, we kind of come up with 5 different topics, and these are kind of clearly defined. We know what this means. So we don't know what employees want to hear about. Well, we're going to find out what that means in the future. It's not timely and frequent. Unprioritized means it's just noisy. I get a ton of emails. I'm not sure which ones I should even read. And then we don't ever explain the why behind some of these communications. Well, in the future, we're going to do that. So we'll know what people want to know, want communication on. It'll be timely, prioritized, and so on. So then think about this as you're creating maybe flip charts. And so you have kind of these 3 flip charts. You kind of spread these 2 apart, put the action items to get there in the middle. And the first one we're going to do are maybe some focus groups or feedback sessions to understand what people want to know. Then we're going to do weekly updates so it's consistent and timely. We're going to prioritize our communications from 1 to 3. Like 1 is need to know, 3 is nice to know. And then we're going to have managers kind of explain the why and have maybe some additional debrief sessions. So this is kind of how we're going to approach communication going forward. And it kind of creates some clarity around this at the organization level. At the team level, it's a little bit different. And so normally we say we do want you to provide some instruction or facilitation for managers. Sometimes we'll do this in a group manager session. We'll have all the managers come together. We'll say, hey, bring your results, your PDF reports, or however you're delivering the results to them. And sit down in your departments and let's pair up one-on-one and discuss your report and what you're seeing in the results and review the results together. Pull out the insights that you're seeing. And then in that meeting, that workshop, you might pause and say, okay, let's pause. Let's come back together. Everyone share an insight that you got from your report. And so we go around the room. We do something like that. Then we get back into potentially actioning and coming up with some potential solutions on the results. Ideally, though, we want the manager to sit down with their team and discuss the results. It's really important. You'll get a lot of goodwill from employees if we simply have the discussion on the results with the group. And when you're looking at goals, we're not trying to create goals necessarily to solve a question on the survey. We're trying to get to the underlying problem maybe that question is talking about. So if workload is really high, let's talk about why that is and what some possible solutions are. The action item here is we typically say break this up into 2 meetings or 2 sessions, two sections. One is let's brainstorm and figure out and talk about the results and get all these ideas, on the table. But let's not solve. Like we don't want to action plan until we really prioritize these topics and determine what we want to focus on. and then you action plan on those results. And so we've got some sample, meeting agendas for the feedback session and things like that. We can provide this information to you to help you facilitate this within your organization. But those really then emerge into a goal. We typically use SMART goals. The idea, though, is that you have some action steps to help you achieve the goal that you've decided as a team to work on. So it's very simple. Again, we tell them focus on one thing and make sure it aligns with the objectives that you're trying to achieve as an organization. All right. I want to kind of wrap up here and talk about next steps. Christian, anything else you want to add here as we talk about some of these practices?
Just consistency. There's so many different versions of surveys and processes and frequency and things, and we see organizations really have to start over if they wait for multiple years between surveys. So it's best practice to pick a time of year and stick to that for an annual survey. Augment that with other pulses and life cycle things, but be consistent. Run it every year so it's something people expect. They build safety and trust in the process, and they also have confidence that some form of action is going to take place as a result of the survey. We see a lot of correlation between I feel like I belong tied to I feel seen and I feel heard. And this is an important way to feel heard and to make sure that we're building that expectation.
Yeah, because the survey itself is an exercise in employee voice, and listening. And so it helps to serve that. But to your point, you got to take some action. Like people want, like I gave you my feedback. If they don't hear or see any effort in terms of making change or improvements based on that, you don't build trust. People don't want to take the survey. So you've got to make some effort in terms of actioning on the results overall.
Right.
Last thing we'll say as an offer here, if you have questions about your current process, what data you're looking at, how you're measuring, we're more than open to have a call with you to kind of provide you some insight and consultation on that at no charge. So let us know if you're interested in doing that, and we can set up some time to talk about your own particular situation. And if you're interested in some of these resources, we'll be sending out the slides, but we have other action planning resources and things like that. We do a lot of training on how to run a survey and create a great employee experience as well. And so we're really trying to help empower you to really carry out a great process within your organization. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. We look forward to having you join us on our next seminar. And we really appreciate your time today. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye now.